Special town hall edition of Wake Up Wyoming as the energy industry is trying to find how it's going to stand up back on its own again. On the phone with us, UW Professor of Economics and Center of Energy, Regulation and Policy, Rob Godby. Sorry to wake up professors before the crack of 11 o'clock. I know that's usually when you're finishing your first cup of coffee, right?
Actually, a little earlier than that. Sadly, really? I have dogs that get me up
okay.
About 5,
so all right. So you're one of those early risers and go for a stroll kind of guys.
Well, whether I like it or not, yeah, that's how the dogs
That's right. Let's get into taking a look at the energy industry. Nick and I were just having a discussion about before the whole COVID-19 problem came along and we started shutting down economic sectors for safety. The industry was already having problems. So besides the problems that the different sectors were having, and then this, they've got to find a way to restart. And I think a lot of that, Professor, is going to just be timing. For example, the oil industry, there was a glut in the market. There were some OPEC problems. What are we talking about as far as how does an industry, let's say the oil industry to pick one, decide the strategy for starting back up again? And what's the timing?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there's a few different things at work. So when you're making those sorts of investments, the first thing you have to worry about is can you make any money? And at current prices, both for oil and natural gas, it's really tough to make money. That was true for natural gas before COVID. You know, we've had a glut of natural gas for years now with fracking across the country. But when oil gets below $40 a barrel, and particularly in Wyoming, because we receive about $5 less than those prices, you know, West Texas Intermediate, those things you hear about on the news, because we got to get our oil to market. And so when oil prices are below about $45, it's really tough to make any money at all. So number one, oil prices need to go back up into kind of that $45, $50 range. The second thing is, as you look forward, you have to feel that there's some certainty that you can bring your oil back to market. And you won't just end up in the same situation we were before. And that's what's so difficult with this crisis. You know, we've seen rising cases again. We don't know whether just as things get started, you know, the so-called second wave may crash down on us, or, you know, we're not even sure we're done with the first wave yet with the resurgence in virus cases we've seen nationally. I mean, yesterday was another record day since the pandemic started of new cases. So uncertainty plays a big role, and, you know, I once was told by an investor, you know, money is like a shy animal, and it stays away until it's certain it's okay to come out.
Yeah, I was about to say, you're going to have to line up a bunch of nervous speculators is what you're going to have to talk them into coughing it up.
Yeah, and, you know, once bitten, twice shy. And then the second thing is, you know, as long as oil prices are this low, it's really tough for anybody to make money, not just in Wyoming, but across the country.
You know, Professor, talking about coal, to pivot for a moment, there were obviously a lot of big issues playing into that beforehand. You know, something that even Senator Barrasso, but certainly President Trump and other GOP leaders have talked about in the last several years was a war on coal. But I think there's a lot of experts who say that it's not just federal regulation that has played into the decline of coal in the last several years. It really is market forces. Can you describe the current coal market right now and how it compared to even just 6 or 7 years ago when things were far rosier?
Yeah, so, you know, if there was a war on coal, it was declared around about 2010 when the fracking boom really hit its stride. The problem is that coal competes directly against natural gas in the market to produce electricity. And natural gas has just been incredibly cheap. So back around, you know, just a decade ago, if we use a 10-year period, we were producing over 400 million tons of coal. This past year, we produced 267. So we're down, you know, over 30%. And that's only gotten worse with COVID, because the problem is, as we produce electricity across the country, and I'm sorry, those are my dogs in the background waking up at the house.
That's all right. I'm sure they're cleaner than Glenn.
Yes, thank you.
So the real issue is when you run a utility, you try to produce electricity as cheaply as possible. If you have renewables, because you've invested in them, when that energy is available, sun shining, wind blowing, it's free. So you use it first. Then you say, okay, what's the next thing I'm going to use? What's the cheapest next source? And it's gas. And then you go to coal. So the problem is coal's kind of that last thing you choose. And that's what's been going on for the past decade. We've lost over a third of our production as as natural gas has taken a big chunk of the market. I mean, effectively, they've reversed positions. 10 years ago, about 45% of our electricity nationwide was produced by coal. Last year, it was about 24. And natural gas had almost exactly flipped. It was producing about 45%, whereas 10 years ago, it was producing about 24%. So that's really the big problem with coal. COVID's just made it worse because as electricity demand went down, what's the first thing that you shut down? Your most expensive production, and unfortunately right now that's coal.
So let me think of it this way then. With a lot of industries, like Nick here is in the news industry, newspapers are having a problem, but that doesn't mean people aren't consuming news. They're just getting it from a different source. So we're still going to produce electricity. In fact, we're going to produce more electricity in the coming years than ever before. It's just how we produce it is shifting. But the energy industry itself is still there.
That's exactly right. I mean, the problem just generally is a really disruptive set of changes in technology. The energy industry typically doesn't change too much, but in the past decade, we've seen the advent of fracking, which has turned upside down the oil and gas market, turned us into the largest oil and gas producer in the world. 10, 15 years ago, people wouldn't have really seen that coming. It's also really created cheap renewable energy. And so, those traditional forms of energy have found it really tough to compete.
I wanted to ask you, too, to what extent is renewable energy competitive against traditional, like fossil fuels, because of government subsidies as far as their development, like building a wind farm?
Yeah, so subsidies certainly make them more competitive, but even without subsidies, if you have a good wind or solar resource, the average price of electricity, so if you kind of think of it over the lifetime of the project, the amount, what do you have to sell your electricity for to cover your costs? That break-even cost for electricity from renewables is right now about half of what it would be for coal. So that's why we've seen such a boom in renewables, where the resource is available. It's just being taken advantage of. The price of renewables or just the development costs have dropped about 70%, and that's without subsidy. The subsidy just makes it worse, but people have to remember those subsidies were intended to go away this year and next because they're really unnecessary now. The only places that they really help are in places where the resource isn't really that great, and they're used for other reasons. But places like Wyoming, it's been a while now where wind energy is just the cheapest way to go, and that's why you see our utilities moving in that direction, planning on retiring coal plants and replacing them with renewables.
Well, Nick and I had a conversation just before you came on the program where I brought up just some rumblings I hear in the industry now and then. So do we at some point start going back to nuclear energy? And some countries want to do that. We certainly have uranium in the state of Wyoming. Rare earth minerals are needed also for the alternative energy sector, and we certainly have rare earth mineral mining starting to pop up around the Sundance area, for example. Is that a viable solution for the state of Wyoming as we diversify?
Well, we'd sure like it to be. Right now, the rare earth minerals, so one of the things about rare earths is they're kind of misnamed. They're not that rare.
Right.
What's rare about them is actually the refining, and the actual activity that creates from those materials what we need in things like batteries.
Or the concentration of them.
Yeah, and it's a really dirty industry. And honestly, in a lot of places you wouldn't want it in your backyard. It's like traditional mining where there's old concentration mills and things like that. And so a lot of that's been done in places like China. So as demand for those minerals goes up, we certainly could have opportunities in Wyoming. The question is the scale. Just how much do we need? And similarly for uranium, we have the largest reserves in the country for uranium, but we compete on an international market where, nuclear power just is not in demand for a couple reasons. One is it's expensive, and the second is people worry about it a lot.
I've got to take just a moment for news and a look at weather. Professor Rob Godby is with us. 6:36 the time. It's Wake Up Wyoming with a special town hall dealing with energy and the economy as we try to find a way into recovery. Nick from our news department sitting right across from me, and then Professor Rod Godby, University of Wyoming. He's Economic Center for Energy Regulation and Policy, and we got to finish up with him so he can go out and walk his dogs. Or have they been walked already?
Oh, they've been taken care of.
Okay,
so
good.
I'm glad to share my coffee with you now.
Not feeling the pressure then. That's pretty good. So, all right.
Not feeling the pressure.
Let's take a look at, for a moment, the state of Wyoming as this ripples across our economy. Again, as we were discussing in the last segment, the downturn, we're really in the energy industry, started before the whole COVID-19 thing. That just made it worse. Now they got to figure out how to come back. Our budget for the state of Wyoming and also cities and counties out the window. And then, of course, this economically ripples to everybody's pocket as well, doesn't it? I mean, it's not just a matter of what's the price at the gas pump. There's so many industries and so many individuals that are affected by the energy industry in Wyoming.
That's absolutely right. I mean, you described it perfectly. We depend on energy for our livelihood in the state. About a quarter of the total production that we measure in Wyoming normally comes from energy. It's twice as much as the next largest sector, which is actually the government. And the number of people that work here, the reason we're so good at energy is because we, relatively speaking, require less people to do it. Only about 10% of our employment depends on it, but 50% of our state revenue, cities, towns, state, it's really the cornerstone of the economy. So how do we get started again? Well, it really depends on the rest of the country being able to get back to work and to do so safely. So what ripples down to everybody's pockets, it's those everybody getting started again that will create the demand that brings the prices back, that allows people to go back to work in the energy sector. But longer term, we've got to think about, really, the key here is, we've ridden this roller coaster for decades now, the boom and the bust. And fundamentally, what we really need to do is move not away from energy, but encourage additional activity in the state. The so-called diversifying, and that's a really tough thing to do because we live in a tough neighborhood. When we've got the Denver Metroplex, the south of us, Salt Lake City to the west, even Rapid City and Billings to the east and north. We play in a tough league. So how do you attract that business to Wyoming when you've got those other centers that are very attractive to business? But that's what we need to do. We really need to diversify what we do so that we are less dependent on single sectors. And we're also going to have to make another tough choice, which is we're going to have to tax ourselves a little bit more. The luxury we had with energy was that we could tax other people. We tax the energy, and about 95% of the energy that we produce in the state, we ship somewhere else. So taxing that energy effectively taxed other people for our public services. That's how we have, among the lowest taxes in the country. And attracting new business requires public services. If taxes were the name of the game, we'd be California and California would be Wyoming. And so we need to really think hard about what is valuable to us, what are we willing to pay for, and ensuring that we have those necessary public services to make this a place that people would like to come to.
Doctor, before we're running up against the clock here, I wanted to get your perspective on the long-term outlook for coal. I mean, let's assume that whether it's now or January or next summer sometime that this virus stuff does relax and we can move past that. How do you see the coal industry bouncing back, and to what degree?
It will probably bounce back somewhat. We expect in the near term next year, just the dynamics of the oil market, which affects the gas market. We expect that, you can't bring oil back online once you shut it down very quickly. So we're expecting that oil prices are going to go up. That's going to drive the eventual demand or production of that commodity. But for coal specifically, we're expecting natural gas prices to go up because there might be a little bit of a shortage as people shut things down in the oil and gas sector. So next year, expect a little bit of a rebound, but that structural decline is kind of built in. Nobody is building new coal-fired power plants in the country because they're just simply too expensive. And so we call it a structural decline. It's kind of like you and I, right? As we get older, we decline. But what we
Don't remind me.
That doesn't mean that as we decline, we are unhealthy. What we need is a healthy industry in the state. Now, it may produce less, but a real problem here, we saw this with the bankruptcy last year with Black Jewel. We need a healthy industry, not one that is that uncertain, because it needs to be predictable. But unfortunately, coal is probably going to continue to decline, just not at the rate we've seen it recently.
Well, doesn't that mean, as we were saying earlier, that energy still needs to be produced? It's not a matter of if Wyoming can continue to produce energy for the rest of the country. It's how we do it that's going to change.
Yeah, that's right. We have lots of energy potential in the state, and fossil fuel demand isn't going to go away tomorrow. We're still going to be using it for decades. So we don't have to completely change overnight. Certainly, renewables are a major opportunity. They're looking at billions of dollars of investment in the state. We could see our wind production double and double again in the next 5 years. There's a lot of jobs there. Unfortunately, they don't replace all of the jobs that we're probably going to lose eventually elsewhere. But it fills part of that hole, and so we will be in the energy business for quite a while. How we produce that energy really depends on world markets and what they need.
Okay. Professor Rod Godby is a UW Professor of Economics, Center for Energy Regulation and Policy. And as we finally start, because, at some point, Professor, things do start moving again, and I'd like to have you back to talk about exactly how things are developing, which I bet you it's not going to look exactly the way we think it's going to look. I bet you this thing rebounds a little bit differently than we've seen it operate in the past.
It probably will, and I would love to talk to you about, the recovery, because that would be a great positive story, and we could start looking forward with optimism.
All right, Professor, thank you for your time. Coming up next,
Doctor.
We have Senator John Barrasso, who's good enough to roll out of bed early in the morning and join us. It's Wake Up Wyoming.